So today I wanted to start Unit 2 with a large overview of how the American political system works. So each of our subsequent units, we will be moving away from the history and starting to learn more about modern politics, the functioning of the branches of government, political parties, etc. So this model that I'm going to cover for you today is really meant to give you an overview and an understanding of the components of the American political system. So you can look at your lesson objective there on the screen and notice that it highlights for you that there's a whole lot of people and a whole lot of groups, formal and informal, that work together to create public policy. And public policy is just a more sophisticated way of saying government action or government inaction for that matter. So public policy is everything that the American government says and does. It can be a law, can be a military action, it can be financial, it can be ignoring, and it can be choosing not to get involved or not do something. So when we think about the American political system, here's like a big picture for you. And notice that it's cyclical. So if you look, there's no end, there's no true beginning. I'm going to show you where theoretically our system originates from. But at the end of the day, it is an ongoing process. There are always winners, there are always losers, and the process ultimately will never be satisfied. So, typically, in a democratic form of government, a republic like ours, we say that things will originate with the people. So, you and I, as individuals or as members of groups with which we associate, we have different interests, we have different concerns, we have different problems, and we'll work to communicate that. Sometimes we'll communicate that by voting, sometimes by running for office, sometimes by making donations. We can rally, we can protest, we can take extreme measures, we can even participate in illegitimate or illegal ways potentially. But all of those things are trying to say to the government, we're mad, we're angry, we're happy, we're this, we're that, but here's what it is we want you to do. I said in the beginning that you can participate as an individual or as a member of a group. Now, I'm cautioning you here. I'm not saying like a formal group, like an interest group or a political party. I'm saying a group with which you identify. I'm a teacher. I'm a mom. I'm college educated. I've always lived in the South. I'm a fairly religious person. So, like, all of those things, I identify with those groups of people, and those things socialize me as well. So, as an individual or as a group, we will work to communicate, and then we tell the government how we feel. But we don't speak directly to the government typically in our country. Remember that we've said that we are far more pluralist in nature. So, in our country, we tend to communicate through what are called linkage institutions. So, these four things on the screen, these are the ways that you and I connect to the government. You know what political parties are. You know what the media is, you know elections. Interest groups you've probably not talked about as much. Interest groups are formal organizations typically organized around a particular topic or area of policy. Their focus is very different than political parties, and we'll do an entire unit on all of these. So you'll learn their structure, their function, what they do. But in every situation, the goal of these is to take the inputs from the people and the groups, take all that information, present that in the form of a policy agenda. And so a policy agenda is kind of like a to-do list. Sometimes it's written in the form of a question, sometimes it's a directive, but I think of it as the to-do list that we are laying at the feet of our government. So we said, I'm super mad. I'm angry. I want something to change. I want something to happen. And then these entities or institutions take that information, coalesce it into a way that it can be presented, which doesn't mean that all of our voices are necessarily reflected in what they do. And then at the feet of the government, they say, here's what we want you to do. So then government responds or doesn't respond, theoretically. And these are our branches of government. Now, I know that my little diagram makes it look like there are 4 branches. There's definitely still 3, just like you've been learning all along. But we do pull bureaucracy out, even though the bureaucracy is part of the executive. We pull them out on their own a little bit because what they do is so very unique. So as we're entering into Unit 2, this is where our study is going to start. Understanding the structure and function of the different branches of government, But from here on out, we're going to call these policy-making institutions, because when they take action or inaction, that becomes public policy. So public policy is, like I said, everything the government says and does. So when the legislative branch passes a law, when the president issues an executive order, when the court makes a decision, when a bureaucratic agency enforces a policy, what they're doing is they're saying they're speaking on behalf of the government. So then those policies, like I mentioned earlier, don't make everybody happy. There are people that are happy, but usually they're never completely happy. And there are people that are sad, and sometimes they're really sad or just a little sad, which means that this will be like a circle. And the next step in this process will depend on how upset the winners are, how upset the losers are, and what their next step of action will be. So I'm going to show you an example of walking through this system. All right. So back in the 1970s, we have this lady, her name's on the screen, Judy Heumann. She started staging a protest, and she was frustrated at the lack of legal protections that existed federally for people who are disabled. And one thing that she saw is that there were provisions out there, but they were really vague. They were super different in the different states. And so she led this big sit-in. So that sparked a movement. And then there were groups of people all over the country that started mimicking this action in their local governments, in their state capitals, and I would think in terms of demographics, people who were really mobilized to want to protect people who are disabled. So perhaps people with disabilities themselves. It could be people who were directly impacted, maybe a loved one, a very good friend. So it's groups of people who were frustrated at the lack of enforcement and the lack of structure to protect people with a myriad of disabilities. So what happens then is after they led this big sit-in, that information kind of gets spread, and we start to see it more and more. So one of the things that happened is that these people, they partnered with political parties. And these disability rights people or activists, they started to influence the political party platforms. And the platform is just a statement of beliefs. So they say to the party, or the party says, this, if you vote for us, here are the things that we're going to do. And both the Republican and Democratic parties adopted into their platform the need to have legislation that actively protected people with disabilities. There was an interest group that was formed. There were many, but one example would be a group called ADAPT. And there was actually a documentary on Netflix that some of you guys may have seen in the past, but they staged this like public crawl. I mean, it was pretty incredible. It wasn't highly publicized. Rather, it appeared that this group of people were going to Washington, D.C. on a holiday, like they were just going to like learn. And they pulled up in front of the Capitol and got rid of whatever their walking disability aids were, so their crutches or their wheelchairs, and they crawled up the Capitol building stairs. And the whole purpose was to make a public demonstration about the lack of physical accommodation that existed in Washington, D.C. So even though this wasn't staged, Washington, D.C. is a very public place. And so there was limited media coverage, but there was enough coverage. Obviously, this is before cell phones, but there was enough coverage that those images became really, really powerful. And they were able to use that to record the event for posterity and use that information to continue to spread the issue. So there was an election in 1988. So, we're 15 years down the line. The first President Bush, so Bush 41, one of the things he campaigned on was the need to have this legislation. So specific laws that would protect people who are disabled. And he won in 1988. And so the perception is that if a politician runs for office, makes a promise, and wins, we say they have a mandate. Now, this isn't like the mandate we talked about with federalism. It's an electoral mandate. But he could believe very rightly that some of the reasons that people voted for him were based on his campaign promises. And so he starts now, once he is in office as president, to use that information. So the policy agenda, like I said, the to-do list. So we have individuals, social movements, linkage institutions. They've all made it super clear that these laws and this ineffective administration is not what we want. And there's huge public opinion to create proactive, specific legislation that will protect people with disabilities. So immediately, we have some legislators that introduce this into Congress. So while the president campaigned on it, he himself, as now as an office holder, can't introduce the legislation. But he did partner with some people in Congress. Notice there on your screen, it still took a long time. This enjoyed wide bipartisan support, but the process to create a law is super long. So even though this was relatively uncontroversial, it still took 9 months for it to become law. So once the bill passes both the House and the Senate, it goes to the executive branch. President Bush signed it into law July 26, 1990. And now the Department of Justice, as part of the bureaucracy, it is now part of their job to ensure compliance with the law. And so what is the law? Well, very basic. It's the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's a law that looks a lot like the Civil Rights Act. It was actually of 1964. It was actually fashioned in that vein, very, like purposely. And it just prevents discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all realms of public life. But the law is not very specific. When I say the word disability, you may have been thinking something very different than what I was thinking when I said it. So the reality is there is going to be a response. Like I said, there are always winners and always losers. So people that were happy, obviously anyone that supported disability rights, and generally most people are happy with this piece of legislation. There are, however, businesses that are going to feel burdened by this because it's going to require them to change their procedures. They're going to have to figure out the process. And while most people would not publicly profess to be in opposition to those with disabilities, it still does put a burden on their business. So we have these two women, Karen Sutton and Kimberly Hinton, who under the Americans with Disabilities Act decide that they're going to take some kind of action. These women applied for jobs as pilots, commercial airline pilots under United Airlines. And because both of them required glasses, so that their vision was not perfect, they required glasses, and United Airlines refused to hire them. So United Airlines is also a group that really cares about this. As a demographic group and as like a corporation in this country, they feel like they have a right to determine the requirements for employment in their company. So various interest groups, Bruce got super interested in this because there is huge consequence, and they started filing what are called amicus curiae briefs. We'll learn about those later in the class. But amicus curiae briefs are ways that we can try to influence action that happens in the court. So Miss Sutton and Miss Hinton did file a lawsuit against United Airlines, and interest groups are trying to influence what the courts are doing. There was a lot of media coverage. Obviously, this is a big deal. We got this new law. We're telling United Airlines you have to hire these people. They're saying, no, we don't. So this makes for news, right? And I think that a lot of businesses were interested and concerned about what's going to happen and the potential consequences to them. So the policy agenda now is written in the form of a question because we are specifically asking the court to make a determination about this law. And that language can be a little bit complicated, but basically we're looking at the constitutionality of the actions of United Airlines under this law. And part of the reason we have that is because the law was not super specific, and we're looking for clarity from the courts. So this time it's only the judicial branch. None of the other branches are directly involved because it is a Supreme Court case called Sutton versus United Airlines. And what they have to decide is poor vision covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act. And as such, have these women been discriminated against? The court said no. They said that poor vision cannot be regarded as a substantially limiting impairment because it didn't stop them from getting jobs. It's saying this one job in this company you will not be allowed to get, but there's a myriad of other opportunities in the industry so who have not been unilaterally discriminated against. So United Airlines obviously won, and they were happy. And any other business who favored kind of this way of thinking and this precedent is going to be satisfied. Disability rights activists were mad, and they said that this was a huge hole in the law. They then went through this process again and put a lot of pressure on Congress, and Congress did amend the law in 2008 to kind of extend it and provide protection. So you guys are going to start today Obviously, no, we're not going to look at this whole model, but the reason I want you to kind of get this overview is we don't study anything in isolation here. We don't look just at one part or just the other part. We have to always be thinking how they're working together because our big picture is this idea of multiple players and institutions working together to impact public policy. So while we, in this unit, we will study the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary in detail, we have to always be thinking about how they work together. So today is going to be kind of like a little boot camp. I've left some assignments for you and some practice for you so that you can start to get comfortable with the structure and function and powers of our different policymaking institutions. So please don't view this work as busy work. While there's some puzzles and some questions and some games, again, it's meant to build some familiarity and some comfort. And even if I were here, we would still be doing these same lessons, maybe a little bit differently, but we would still be doing them. So everything that you do today is super important and helping to like build some language and some background in our policymaking institutions.